Hi everyone, welcome. We're down here in my wormery, and what you see here in front of us is the green tub in which I used to keep my African nightcrawlers. And what happened 25 days ago was I had taken the worms out of this container. Prior to that, while the worms were still inhabiting this container, I began feeding the container on only one side, which had encouraged the worms to all depopulate the finished worm castings. So what's left in this is really just a container of nothing more than worm castings. And I've been keeping it covered so to not allow it to dry out too much. And at some point, I'll probably put it in storage. I've just been trying to keep it separate from my other worm castings that you see down there in those two buckets on the floor. Those are worm castings from red wigglers, and these are just the castings from the African nightcrawlers. No real practical reason for keeping them separate other than the fact that I thought that there may still be some worm cocoons left in this material, and I thought that maybe after a few weeks I might see the emergence of some baby worms in here. So I'm not holding my breath. We'll see what happens. But like I mentioned, 25 days ago I managed to pull out the last of, or at least what appeared to be the last of the worms from this container. And what happened was I had relocated them into a new environment. That new environment is right here in the VermiBag Tote. The VermiBag Tote is resting inside of a bus box. Originally, it was designed to sit inside of a storage tote, but I found that this bus box was a pretty good fit. So I decided I would run the system out of there, and it's been in there for 25 days now. And the only thing about this is that I've always felt that it might be a good idea to try to spread out my nightcrawler populations, because all these other systems that you see here, all these systems are red wigglers. That right there is my only system that has the African nightcrawlers in it. And similarly, I've got another system here. This VermiBag Mini is the only system in which I have European nightcrawlers. So for some time now, I've been thinking it would be a good kind of little insurance policy to try to get my worm population in this African nightcrawler system and this European nightcrawler system at least divided up, so that I'll at least have one backup system in which I've got any particular one kind of worm. So I was worried that that system could, somehow have some sort of a problem. Maybe all the worms would die for whatever reason, and then I'd be left without that type of particular worm. So today we're going to be moving some of those African nightcrawlers into this system down here on the shelf. This system was built 14 days ago, and it's just your basic worm system. It's got some bedding, and I stashed some food in there, and after 14 days I would think that this system is nice and primed for the introduction of worms. The only reason I'm running it this way within another tub is because, as you can see, the container has holes, and similarly the top container also has holes, and I just don't want to have things kind of dripping out, falling out, and I've kind of moved away from using these perforated bins anyway, so I figured I would kind of combine them. And from what I could tell, none of the holes really line up on the two containers, so there's no real direct way for anything to drop out the bottom. And I decided that this would be the way I try to put these two perforated bins back into service, which is by setting it up as a new system and grabbing some of the African nightcrawlers out of that tub over there and getting them launched into here. So that's my game plan for today. We're going to begin by getting some of the nightcrawlers out of the VermiBag Tote, and then we're going to launch them into their new home. All right, looking forward to this. Let's get to work. So within this VermiBag Tote, we're going to find some fairly freshly added food. It was only 2 days ago that I came in here to feed this bin. And my hope was that within 2 days, hopefully, that feeding area might be pretty densely populated with worms coming over to grab a bite to eat. So I hope my hunch is correct. I hope that it's relatively easy to scoop out a number of worms from this system. It's funny how sometimes I find worms stuck right between sheets of paper. I think I've gotten them all, and then I find a worm or two stuck right between different sheets of paper. My only My only reason for wanting to get them off the paper is that I wouldn't want to see one of them, while I'm not paying attention, crawl off the paper and end up on the floor, on the table somewhere that I don't spot them, and then, they'd end up drying out, and that would be history for them. Seems like I've gotten the majority of them, but I've got one hanging on here for dear life for whatever reason. Let go. So you can see, this is what worms do to a piece of paper that's resting right beneath a piece of plastic. You saw that piece of plastic we lifted off. That plastic creates nice terrarium effect, causes the recirculation of moisture to occur right there. All that moisture getting trapped and dropping back down gets caught on that sheet of paper, making it into a really cozy spot for the worms that they like to come up and hang out in. So I've got myself this clear plastic tub that I pretty regularly use for this sort of thing. It's a pretty good sized container, and I'll be keeping the worms in this temporarily as I scoop them out, and that'll give me a little time to set this bin back up on the shelf and get the new bin that these little guys are going to be relocated into out here so we can release them. So let's see, what's the best way to proceed here? Originally I had even thought about maybe just chopping the entire contents of the bin right in half and then moving all that stuff over into the new bin. That would leave kind of a minimal amount of stuff in this container, because that other container is already also filled with its own stash of bedding and some foodstuffs and stuff like that. So ideally I don't want to pull out too much of the contents of this bin. I'm really after worms only. So I'm going to see what I could do about maybe even leaving some of the stuff behind that's not worms. I'm trying to bring over worms only. So let's see what we can do as far as scooping into this feeding area to see what we can get. Like I said, I'd prefer to try to leave some of this food that was fed to this bin here and take only worms with me, if that's even possible. It does seem like I'm getting a number of worms here and there. But since this stuff is kind of gooey, I am wondering if I'm even going to be able to accomplish what I'm trying to do here. So we've got a few worms, but I think we need a little more than that to start off a new worm bin. I'm also wondering if maybe after feeding this bin last time, maybe the worms just haven't had a chance to really populate the feeding area yet. Usually they'll want to wait a little while and let the contents of the feeding start to break down a little bit, kind of let some mold and bacteria and fungi and certain things kind of get a foothold in the food items. Then the worms will move in and start taking part in the feeding. So I'm wondering if maybe after 2 days some of these food items that I just added might still just be too fresh to be attracting worms. Maybe not. It does seem like I'm seeing some worms in here. I did find leftovers from previous feedings in here last time I fed, so maybe they're coming back in, getting drawn by some of the partially decomposed food that was already in here prior to this last feeding. So here too, I'm getting a few more, but probably no more than 100 or 2 tops. So we're going to keep going to see what else we can round up here as far as volunteers go. This looks like a little bit better of a stash. Starting to wonder if somewhere other than the feeding zone might be a good place for us to check. Somehow I feel like I'd like to have more worms than just this. This doesn't seem like all that much, although, given time they should propagate and expand their numbers. But I usually like to start my bins with a larger quantity of worms to get things off to a good quick start. But if today I'm unable to accomplish that, then it wouldn't be the end of the world either. I suppose another thing I could have done was I could have just waited a little while longer until some of this food in here really just had a chance to break down. And I've also got to keep in mind that besides the worms that I can see right out here on the surface, there's probably a bunch down lower trying to escape from the bright lights overhead. So once I kind of turn up the pile a little bit like that, I do see a few more, making me feel like we are actually accomplishing something here. I'm just trying to take care not to return too many worms back to where I pulled them out of. I'd really like to limit the stuff that I'm returning to the VermiBag as just uneaten food if possible. But it's not the end of the world. If a little bit of bedding and food and whatnot comes along for the ride with the worms, that's fine too. So let's keep at this. I think we've done as much as we can down where the feedings had been occurring. So maybe we'll try venturing out a little bit outboard of the last feeding to see if we can potentially find an area where we might have success in finding even more of these little guys. I guess one idea I had was maybe just adjacent to the feeding area. Let's see, like over here, for example. I still feel like I've got another pile of stuff that's somewhat this hasn't been disrupted yet too much. It's a little bit off to the side, so it's not exactly the most recent feeding. Maybe it's just some stuff that got pushed aside and was leftovers from a feeding prior, which is going to probably be more likely to have a greater number of worms hanging out in it. And the stuff that they're hanging out in is going to be also a little bit more gooey and mushy, and maybe more castings and more heavily broken down food items. But that to me seemed like it was a pretty good handful of worms. Pretty high ratio of worms to whatever else the stuff was that they came along in. So we're doing pretty good here. I would almost say at this point, probably got something in the neighborhood of a couple hundred worms or so. Just going to kind of stir this around a little bit so we can see better how many we've ended up with. If I could find some larger chunks of food that don't need to go along for the ride, I'll pull those out too. So I'm no good guesser. I can never tell how many marbles are in the jar. Not good at those games, but I don't know. I would have to say that we've probably pulled out at least a couple hundred already. I think my estimate for how many worms are actually in this VermiBag is somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,000 worms. So if we can get to that point where we feel like we've pulled out 500 or so worms, then we would really be at that point in a 50-50 split in terms of what I expect my entire African nightcrawler population to consist of. But it's certainly not terribly important that we get that many. Even if we can get to the point where we feel like we've gotten ourselves a few hundred volunteers to come over and be the pilgrims in this new bin, then I'd be satisfied. Okay, once again, I shouldn't go too crazy here. Just try to, oh, that felt to me like there might have been some nice slimy worm action down here. Maybe some older chunk of decomposing food that they're feasting on. So it does seem like we managed to get a pretty good bunch in that handful. I'm just trying to evict them from a couple of these larger chunks of whatever that I'm finding as I go through. I'm wondering if along those same lines of thinking, if we might be able to round up a similar amount from the other side that's flanking the area where we most recently fed. There too, we probably would find a certain amount of material that's not yet broken down from past feedings of this container. So that would be right about here. So maybe we'll just take a couple more stabs at scooping out some more worms, and then we'll leave it at that. So here too, let's see if we can find a spot where there's a good number of worms hanging out. Yeah, not bad. Does seem to be a pretty good number of worms right there. They're definitely drawn to the material that's been in the bin for a while. So whenever I add fresh food, I typically don't expect that this stuff's going to attract worms right away. I know that it takes time for it to start breaking down. And all the while I know that the worms are still busy eating leftovers from previous feedings. So I think if we manage to get another handful or two just like that, then we'll be in really good shape here. Yeah, look at that. There's another nice big mound of worms right there. And I think with that we're gonna end with our extraction of worms from this bin. So I wouldn't want to pull too many out. I'd like to leave a fair number in here to continue their thing. My hope is that by giving these worms a little bit more space, kind of reduce the crowding, I'll be able to hopefully spur on a little bit of mating activity so that they'll attempt to fill that space with greater numbers of worms. I'm also kind of hoping to see these little guys get a little bit larger, because that green container that they had occupied previously was rather small, somewhat cramped conditions in there for them. And I believe that worms will grow bigger when they've got lots of space, but conversely they'll remain somewhat small if they're cramped for space. So I don't know, it's hard to say. Maybe I can stir this through a little bit more once or twice just to give us a better view of what we've ended up with here. But I am definitely thinking that we've got to have ourselves almost 500 worms in here. So I'd love to hear people's ideas on what they think in terms of how many worms we've got here. We'll get a better view of them too once we go ahead and empty this container over into the new bin that they're going to be occupying. So another thing I might be able to achieve here is the exclusion of a little bit more of this material that they're occupying right now. If I can sort of stack it up a bit, and it'll just sit out here under these bright lights for a few minutes. Maybe I could scoop off some of this material from the top once the worms have burrowed down into it, stuff that I know is not worms. And then we'll have an even better view of what might be closer to being just a pile of worms only. Trying to minimize the amount of castings and food scraps and bedding and stuff that they're piled into right now. But I think we've actually done a pretty decent job here. Just based on the weight of it, yeah, I would definitely have to guess that we're probably somewhere in that 500 worm range. So let's get things in here covered up a little bit. With these bags, I always wonder a little bit if the edges are going to get dry, because there's always food being added down the middle where there's a lot of moisture emitting from the food, keeping the entire contents in that area nice and damp all the time. But the outer edges is where I worry a little bit, thinking that maybe it has the potential to dry out. But luckily, since this bag is resting inside of a plastic container, it does seem to be holding moisture quite nicely, even out on the far edges. And I can tell because it feels nice and cool. And the other good sign is the fact that it's got worms all over the place in it. The worms would be put off and not go there if it was exceedingly dry. So, okay, very good. Kind of glad that I've got some of my African nightcrawler worm population separated out now. But we're not done yet. I'll be much more happy once I can see that they're in their new home and that I've finally got a secondary African nightcrawler population as a backup. And who knows, maybe at some point I'll continue trying to expand my population, but it did seem to me a little bit risky to have the entirety of my African nightcrawler population in just one container. And I feel the same way about my European nightcrawlers too, so at some point soon I'm going to have to set up a new bin for them too and get volunteers out of the VermiBag Mini to get that system launched, but that's stuff to be done another day. Today we're launching a new bin, so let's go fetch that new bin and get it out here. Okay, so the one thing about this bin right here on top, the other reason I wanted to rest it inside of a secondary tub is because of this corner here. If you remember the last time I was running this container with red wigglers in it, I was constantly concerned about that breaking. And I did actually mend it with some construction adhesive and some other stuff, but at this point, knowing that it's within another container, kind of reduces the concern that I might end up dropping the whole thing on the ground. And I also kind of like the fact that the holes that are on the bottom of this container are not going to allow all kinds of stuff to come dripping out and dropping out and making a mess on whatever's beneath it. Alright, so 14 days. This bin has had a nice opportunity to get primed. Besides all the stuff that you see down in here, the leaves, there's going to be cardboard, there's going to be paper, there's going to be food scraps scattered all throughout the container. So the worms should be quite at home when they get dropped in here. This is a really nice environment. You can even see a little bit of kind of, I don't know, mold or something growing on here. All stuff that the worms are really going to enjoy. So let's bring back our collection of worms. Like I said, they've gone ahead and gotten out of view. They don't like the bright lights overhead, so if you scrape off some of the material on top, you'll eventually get to the point where you'll find worms right below it. And sometimes I'll try to do this in an effort to reduce what's in the container down to as much as possible, at least worms only, and then weigh it. But I think I'm going to stick to just sort of a visual estimation of how many worms I've managed to pull out of here. So I'm going to stick to that guess of 500 worms. But, oops, I think once we drop the contents of this down into the container, I'll spread them out a little bit. That's when we're going to get our best view of how many worms I managed to round up in this. So, without any further delay, why don't we get this started? Here we go. There's one right in there. Let's not forget that worm behind, and I think we've got them all. Yeah, it's kind of a cool feeling when you run your finger down into a pile of worms and you can tell that it's a substantial number. Here and there the pile's a little deeper than in other places. So I'm not going to mess with these guys. I'm going to let them be. Let them all get settled down into their new home, and then we'll be finished. I think I could still see a couple worms over here that have not entirely submerged. I think I see a couple here too, but I think that's pretty close. I'm going to put these little guys out of their discomfort by being out here in these bright lights and I think it's time to put this bin back up on the shelf. But before we do, sticking with tradition, we're going to go ahead and tip the whole system up here on its edge because I've got a sticker, and the sticker just indicates what the date is today. It's the 13th of October. And other than that, there's still the whole thing about covering things up here and putting things away and cleaning things up, but I think that stuff's a little bit boring, especially considering what we just watched there, watching all those worms squirm away. That was kind of fun. So I think we're pretty much done. So before I go, let me just really quickly say thanks. Thanks for watching. I really hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please remember to give me a quick thumbs up. Also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated. All right, everyone. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye-bye.